Good morning, Irfan. How are you doing?
Hello, good evening, Rob. How are you? Fine?
Doing very well, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. You have on time here. We
Oh,
will
yes.
continue at next 15 minutes. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
8 o'clock. So how are you?
Doing well.
So do you already have vaccination?
Yes. Both
Okay.
Betty Ann and I were vaccinated about a month ago. So we
Mm-hmm.
actually got to see our grandchildren 2 weeks ago for the first time in 4 months.
Yes. Performance. Yeah, yeah. So for one that so you got twice
Yes,
vaccination or just
yes.
one? Yes, twice.
We
For
got the
how
Moderna
long between the
vaccination
first one and the
twice.
second?
21 days.
Okay. And then next 4 months? Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Uh,
we have been 21 days, and so now we're
mm-mm,
finished. We should be vaccinated.
mm-mm, mm-mm. One moment, please. Bito, kau buka ke itu, Be? Besar ke itu? Yang ini aku nak kecil ke? Besar ke yang itu? Ini kurang jelasin. So we are setting the sound because your voice is not too clear.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
So do I
It's
have
already.
to talk louder or more slowly? Which
Mm-mm.
one will be more effective? Talking slowly or louder?
Mm-mm. Okay, I will try to change my. We have mini studio over there. I will have to change to go to studio. Ini
Okay.
berarti nggak bisa aku nak pergi aku kasih ini.
Okay. So now, how is my voice coming across now? Too loud, or do we need to further adjust the?
Good one. It's
Okay.
better
So
than before.
you have
Okay.
it set.
Mm-mm. So we also already have a vaccine also and Sinovac
Mm-hmm.
vaccine. For the first one is I got in a month ago, and then after 15 days I have the second one. So do you feel any like reaction after the vaccination?
We were lucky. Our arms were sore where we got the vaccination, but that's all. No
Yes,
fever
yes.
or anything like that. But
Okay.
about 30% of people have a significant fever and a significant reaction to it.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Pfizer vaccine, eh?
And we were Moderna, and the Moderna
Oh,
also.
Moderna vaccine. Okay. Oh, so we also have like a sore on the shoulder, and we feel like sleepy after
Mhm.
that for one day, sleepy. But that's all. That's all. I think. Yeah. For how long do you say that 4 months? You had to go to vaccine again?
No,
No, no. Okay.
we had not seen our grandchildren since
Yes.
October,
Oh.
so, and they live about 100 miles away.
100 miles.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yes.
we did not see them for our Thanksgiving, Christmas, any of the New Year's,
Yeah.
any of
Yeah.
the holidays.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was
Yeah.
good to be able to see them
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. So the government very restricted to going the rule.
We It's not so much enforced by the government. It was more we chose not to because we're over 65. We did not want
Oh
to run the
yeah,
risk
yeah, 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 yeah.
of
Of
having a
course.
bad response
Yeah.
to the
So,
virus.
okay. So how many millions people of United States that already get the vaccine? How many percent?
I think we're up to about 20%, somewhere around
20%.
50 million people.
Oh, yeah. In Indonesia, this is the second phase. For the first phase is for the health worker,
Yes.
for all of the health workers. But I think it is not optimized because uh, surprisingly that many health workers didn't want to be vaccinated. I don't know why. Yes, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, it's too bad. Maybe only 50 or 60%. And then the second piece is for public workers like policemen and something that public service workers. This is the second piece, including the teachers. So
Right.
maybe next week we will for medical teachers, because they are included as a health worker. Most of them is already vaccinated. And for this week, maybe next week, I will organize for all of the university teachers, around 1,000 lecturers that in University of Sriwijaya. Maybe next week we have to vaccinate it. Yes.
Yes, we were lucky in that we had all of our medical students helping out with clinics, so all of our medical students were vaccinated as healthcare workers.
Yeah. Yes.
We still are not meeting face-to-face for classes, and we're
Yes.
going to wait until August before we go back to live classes.
Okay, good one. So we also that have to, for clinician medical student, for clerkship already have vaccinated, but unfortunately for the first phase medical student, still not, because they are still at home until now.
Yes.
Seems like you, yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, by the way, Prof, we continue to our discussion at the email, like I sent to you, that our plan to building formative assessment.
Yes.
So do you have time after the lecture, maybe half hour or 1 hour? Because I want to ask our faculty members, maybe 5 or 6 of them. They are the committee of the assessment unit in our faculty. So would you mind that we can discuss after this one? Okay, thank you very much. That after your lecture. Okay.
Very good.
Ya, Wito, lagi ingatkan Pak Sadai, habis kuliahnya, nanti kita diskusi sama Prof. Ya, I will give order to the members that don't go away after your lecture. Okay. And Rob, actually that your lecture is streaming by YouTube.
Okay.
Because most of the Indonesian physiologists also want to see your lecture. So I sent to Indonesian Physiological Society members.
Okay.
It's okay to you? Yes.
Sure, I'll have a lot of my friends watching this.
Yes. Adrianta must be watching them. Minarma or all of them. Okay. Wito, apa yang PowerPoint-ku tuh pindah aja sini. Karena aku ada PowerPoint. Pakai pestis lagi buka sekarang CSP. Prof, there is Prof. Dr. Harry over there. Dr. Harry, hello, Dr. Harry.
Hello.
Where is your video, Dr. Harry?
Very nice.
Good morning,
Rob. Selamat pagi.
Nice to see you.
It's good to see you also.
Yeah. You already have vaccination, yeah?
Yes, we were
I'm
fortunate.
also.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is good to be old. So we were old enough that we got vaccinated in the early.
Yes.
In our early phase. But it's interesting over here because they are using multiple forms of the vaccine. So either the Pfizer, the Johnson & Johnson, the Moderna, and you have to keep track of which one you had.
Oh.
Because the ones that require a second dose, it has to be of the same vaccine that you had the first dose of.
Oh. Yes, Rob. By the way, that last 2 days, two days ago, that we also have a lecture from Prof. Nori.
Oh, excellent.
Yes. So he said that our next IUPS next year will be in Tianjin for the education workshop. Is this true?
That is the plan, yes.
Okay. What times? It is before the Congress or after that?
It will be after the Congress.
After the Congress, okay.
Yes.
For 2 days, I think, still, or 3 days?
I think 3 days.
3 days, yeah.
Because
Okay.
the first day is going to have to be transferred from the Congress down to
Yes.
Tianjin.
Yes.
And at most, we might have an opening plenary and a reception afterwards.
Oh,
So-
yeah, good one, really.
And 2 days of,
Okay.
of real workshop.
Okay, we have to dance over there.
Of course.
Like you did before in Palembang, yeah?
Yes.
So I will bring this song that you have, yeah, then you have to dance. Yeah, by the way, that I plan to bring my faculty members, a lot of them. So
Oh,
I asked
excellent.
them to save the money and from now on
Yes.
to go to Beijing. And Nori also said that on the next year, 2023, so the POPs will be changed from Tehran to where? He said that
To central South Korea. I forget
South
the name
Korea.
of the city. But
Oh,
it'll be in
yeah,
South
yeah.
Korea.
Okay,
I think the city begins with a P. I don't remember
Okay.
the exact name.
okay. So Nori also said he is the chair of education committee for FAOPS, yeah. Very
Yes,
good
he
one.
is.
So, because I also the chair of education committee of Indonesian Physiology Society.
Oh, my. Congratulations.
I have Adrianta. Adrianta actually the chair of that, and I vice chair of.
Okay.
Okay. Should we start now? Oh no, still 4 minutes. Hello, student. So we are still collecting the student. There is already 160 student and also some of the faculty member join with our Zoom now. I have to open this one. Set. Mana tadi? Oke. Ini mana? Ini ya.
Itu yang belum listatnya.
Ya, yang inilah yang aku kenal. Oke. Siswa sudah
Kurang.
ada berapa banyak? Hah?
Kurang.
Masih kurang.
200.
200. So when will D will be start her jobs as the president?
Yes, she will become president of the American Physiological Society in 2023. So April 2023 is when
Okay.
she will take over.
So what is her task now as president
She will
elect?
be, the way the society works is you have a president-elect for 1 year,
Mm-hmm.
then president for 1 year, and then you're a past president for 1 year. So it's a
Okay.
3-year cycle.
Okay. Oh, so what is her task for as a president elect? What is doing on?
She will be organizing the 2023 meeting for the society
Yeah. Okay.
and pretty much running all of the finances, the
Oh, yeah.
organization. So
Okay.
the whole shooting match. President's a very powerful position within the American society.
Yeah. So we hope that for the next year you are going to be a president elect also. Yeah.
Yes. And it's a good organization because you have 1 year to learn how it works,
Yeah.
then 1 year to do your work, and then for the next year you're sort of the resource person for the next person in line.
Yeah.
So it provides good continuity to the society.
Yes. Okay. So we can start now, 8 o'clock. Okay, Rob, I think we will start. So the first one that I want to introduce you to in front of my students. Actually, we already have the 185 participants, but actually the student will be maybe around berapa? Dito? Mahasiswa 230. So maybe they can catch up the Zoom meeting. So for everyone, good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Halo, adik-adik, sapa dong sama Prof-nya. Disapa Profesor Prof-nya.
Halo, Profesor.
Hello, Professor.
Good morning, Prof.
Yes, so I want to introduce Professor Prof before he start to give your lecture today. So you can see now. This is Professor Prof Carroll. You remember this photograph, Professor?
I do indeed. Yes.
Yes. So this is Professor Robert G. Carroll, PhD. So in 2018, he was the king of Sriwijaya, Palembang. So because of that, he got the picture of this one. So Professor Rob has been visited us in 2018, and I hope for the next time Professor Rob will also visit us in Palembang. And Professor Rob Carroll is a professor of physiology and associate dean of Brody Medical School, East Carolina University, United States, and also he is a chair of Education Committee, International Union of Physiological Society. So students, that you have to know that we have our own society as physiologists. And part of the society, we have education society. So the teacher of physiology have their own community to share each other. Like this one, that this is our meeting in Birmingham. You remember, Rob?
Yes,
in 2013. And as you can see that the middle one is Rob, and in front of Rob is the president-elect of American Physiology Society now, Professor D. Silverton. You will meet her at Monday, Professor Rob. So Silverton also will give the lecture for next Monday. And as you can see on the right one, this is Professor Nori that you have been met before in Monday. And mostly this is education member of physiologists. Professor Rob this morning will give a lecture to all of us about the body fluid compartments and physiological solution. Is a part of his expertise, and you can see his reputation in science in the Google Scholar or in the Scopus or in anywhere. As you can see that Professor G. Carroll is one of the most reputable scientists and professor in the world. So I think this all for my introduction, Professor Rob. So we already make you as a co-host, so you can share your own PowerPoint. It's okay for you. And please take your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Irfan, for that introduction. Selamat pagi, assalamualaikum. Nama saya Robert Carroll, and that's about all of the Bahasa that I can speak. I've enjoyed my visits with, I'm getting some feedback on the microphone. Okay, if everyone could mute their microphone, that will help. I'm sorry that the pandemic is preventing me from returning to Palembang, because I've enjoyed myself immensely visiting your university and my friends there over the past couple times. This morning, I'm going to speak with you about body fluid compartments and physiological solutions. if you want to get a hold of me, by far the simplest way to find me is to use my email. So it's just last name, first letter, the first name @ecu.edu. Brody School of Medicine shares a lot in common with the University of Sriwijaya. Our focus of our school is on producing general practitioners, which in the United States is called family medicine. And Brody ranks #1 in our state and #2 in the United States in that area. Our university is in this portion of the United States, the eastern part of North Carolina. Our school is in the top 10% of US medical schools for students who remain in practice in state, practice primary care, and also practice for underserved communities. So this is really one of the focuses of our medical school. I joined the faculty here in 1984 and have advanced through the academic ranks and currently am the Associate Dean for Medical Student Education at the university. So at my core, I'm an educator. I think education is very important. So whenever you're trying to present information, it's always important to give these students an idea of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to calculate the total body water volumes in the different compartments. You should be able to identify the normal values for osmolarity and plasma electrolytes. Show how to use indicator dilution to measure volumes. Identify the major routes and normal ranges for water intake and loss. And then predict the changes in the body fluid compartments caused by addition of different physiological solutions. So body fluids. The body is essentially a bag of salt water. We're about 60% sodium chloride solution. That 60% is sort of an average. It varies based on adiposity, based on muscle mass, based on other components. But generally, when we try and look at a generic person, we talk about that person as a 70-kilogram man. And that's something that I have not been since I've been 16 years old. But that works out to be of my 70 kilograms, 42 kilos is water. We are mostly water. When you look at where that water is distributed within the body, it can be in 3 major compartments. It can be in the plasma compartment within the blood vessels. It can be within the interstitial fluid, that space outside of the blood vessels, but not yet inside of the cells. And finally, it can be within the cells. When you look at the volumes that are in those spaces, 2/3 of the water is inside of our cells. Only about 1/3 is outside of the cells. And of that 1/3 outside of the cell, most of that extracellular fluid is in the space in between the cells, or the interstitial fluid. Physiology is concerned with the exchange of fluids from these compartments. So in the cardiovascular system, you learn how the exchange of volume from the plasma space to the interstitial space is going to cause edema, things of that nature, ascites, those types of diseases. Fluid that does get into the interstitial space can be returned back to the cardiovascular system, to the plasma, by way of the lymphatics. So we now have 2 different routes where fluid can be either exchanged across the blood vessels at the capillaries, or some fluid can be carried from the interstitial fluid back into the plasma space through the lymphatics. The other exchange is going to be between the extracellular fluid and the cell water. That in order to make that exchange, the water is going to have to go across the cell membrane. What will determine whether or not that fluid moves is going to be based on the osmotic gradient. So in looking at the fluid exchange, you need to have an approach for how you're going to understand disturbances in fluid volume. Our students find it easiest if they always start their differences occurring within the plasma volume. So when you think about ingestion or metabolism, the first space that that volume goes to is the plasma volume. When you think about the loss of water from the body, either in the urine, through the respiratory system, through feces, sweat, or the skin, that should also come out of the plasma volume. So the plasma volume is the space that helps to buffer the body fluids from the outside of the body and the inside of the body. The plasma is about 4 or 5% of body weight. It's 3 liters and not the blood cells. Another 2 liters or so are the red blood cells. So we talk about the circulating blood volume as being 5 liters. The extracellular fluid is a combination of both the plasma and the interstitial fluid. That works out to be about 20% of body weight for some 14 liters. And then the volume inside of the cell, the intracellular fluid, is about 40% of body weight for some 28 liters. I've got 2 different compartments here, compartment A and compartment B. In compartment A, we have a whole lot of particles, and B, not so many particles. I've got a barrier through which these particles cannot move, but water is going to move. So which way is water going to move? Is water going to move into side A or into side B? Take a moment.
Side A.
Into side A.
A.
Yeah. Okay. And as long as you have water going into side A, we're in good shape. I don't care if you think about it as water going down the water concentration gradient, water going toward the particles, but it's important that you make the water go on to side A from side B. What determines that, and that's where we're going to talk about osmolarity and tonicity. And there are 2 words that are very similar. Osmolarity is millimoles of solute per kilogram of water. Osmolarity is millimoles of solute per liter of water. In dilute solutions, those terms are interchangeable. So you don't have to make a distinction between those terms because body fluids are a dilute solution. The reason why we care about that is there's a physical chemical property of water called the activity, which changes based on the osmolarity. The property of the solution depends on the number of molecules and not on their nature. So 1 albumin with a gram molecular weight of about 20,000 has exactly the same osmotic effect as 1 molecule of sodium with a gram molecular weight of 35. It's the number of particles, not their nature, which contributes to the colligative properties of solution. So we need to have some relatively precise definitions for the term we're going to talk about. Osmolarity is something that is measured in the lab. I can go out into a lake in Palembang, I can pull a sample of water, bring it into the lab, I can measure what the osmolarity of that water is. There are 2 terms that are used to describe the osmotic movement of water across the barriers. What helps determine that term is the barrier. If we're talking about the movement across the cell membrane, then we're going to be concerned about the tonicity of the fluids. If we're concerned about the movement across the capillary endothelium, then we're going to talk about the oncotic pressure or the colloid osmotic pressure for the solutions. So take a look at this problem and figure out what answer you want to choose. So how are we feeling? What is the nature of the sodium chloride solution?
B. Hyperosmotic.
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 Okay. If you put the red blood cell into a solution and the water moves from the solution into the cell, the solution is dilute. It's hyposmotic. So let's go through the underlying mechanism. I've got a red blood cell. The normal plasma osmolarity is up at about 280 mils or milliosmoles per liter. If I place that red blood cell into a dilute solution, a hypotonic solution, water is going to go from the solution into the cell. The cell then is going to swell. If the osmolarity of the solution is below 200 milliosmoles, that cell will swell so much that it will rupture or it will lyse. So you get hemolysis if you put a red blood cell into a very dilute solution. In contrast, if I take that same cell and I put it into a hypertonic solution, that cell is going to shrink. The term used to describe that is crenation. As that cell shrinks, some of the cytoskeleton elements are going to start poking against the cell membrane, and it will assume a little star, a little jagged shape to it. The third option is the solution that I put it into is isotonic. If I put it into an isotonic solution, then there would be no change in volume. The fact that there's no change in volume is what defines that solution as being isotonic to what the cell membrane or to what the cell is. So I want to move away from osmolarity for a moment and revisit one of the common themes in physiology. That theme is indicator dilution. If I've got an unknown volume within inside a flask and I add a known amount of dye, 1 milligram in this example, I end up with a flask of colored water. It's possible to pull a sample of that and measure the concentration. If I know the final concentration and I know the amount of dye that I added, you can back calculate what the starting volume is. That same process works even if there's already some dye in the water. So if I've got some dye already present and I add 1 more milligram of dye to the solution, the calculation changes to or alters to the change in calculation. It was at 0.1 milligram per mil, it finished at 0.6. So the amount added divided by the change in concentration still gives you that same volume. The exact same principle also works if it is a moving volume, if it's a volume per time. So if I look at the lungs and I look at how much oxygen is being picked up across the lungs, and I know the difference in the oxygen concentration from the blood as it passes through the pulmonary capillaries, the calculation is the same. The amount divided by the change in concentration is going to let you calculate what the flow is. So you can use this principle to determine cardiac output in individuals. The reason why it's useful to come back and remember that this is a recurring theme is you'll see this showing up when you're trying to measure residual volume in the pulmonary system, measuring the different clearance aspects for renal function, measuring cardiac output. And if you learn it as just a recurring theme, then you don't have to learn a new application each time. It's just applying the indicator dilution to the next organ system that you're encountering. So this is the similar diagram to the first one. I've got my cell water down on the bottom, the interstitial fluid there, and the plasma on top. If I pick a compound which will only distribute in one space, then the dilution of that compound will let me calculate the volume. If I want to know what the plasma volume is in an individual, I can either put in albumin, which remains in the vascular space, or Evans blue, which is a dye that binds to albumin. If I want to know what the extracellular space is, I can either put in a known amount of inulin or radiolabeled sodium. The dilution of those compounds will give me the combination of both what the plasma and the interstitial space is. If I want to know what the total body water is, I can use deuterium, which is an analog of hydrogen, or else a compound called antipyrine, which distributes across all of the body water. So you can use indicator dilution and one compound in order to measure any of the body fluid volumes. There are two of them that you have to get indirectly. You can't measure just interstitial volume, so you would have to measure the total extracellular volume and subtract from that the plasma. And you can't measure just the cell water. You would have to calculate what the total body water is and subtract from that the extracellular space. So I'm going to come back to this theme multiple times. You've got the volume within the capillary, you've got the volume within the interstitial fluid, and you have a volume within your cells. When you look at the composition of those volumes in those spaces, sometimes it's very similar, sometimes it's different. So for proteins, because of albumin and the large molecular weight proteins, the protein concentration inside the capillary is much higher than it is in the extracellular fluid, in the interstitial fluid, but not quite as high as it is within the water inside of the cell. If I look at my electrolytes, normal plasma sodium, typical plasma sodium, somewhere around 140 millimoles per liter, potassium 4.5, and the interstitial fluid values are equivalent. The sodium and the potassium can easily exchange across the capillary, so they come into an equilibrium. Sodium and potassium cannot easily cross the cell membrane. Consequently, the sodium is at a very low concentration inside of the cell, and potassium a very high concentration outside of the cell. When you look at the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary, it can be up to about 23 millimeters of mercury. Interstitial fluid pressure is somewhere around -4. The oncotic pressure from proteins in the capillary is about 28, as opposed to about 2 in the interstitial fluid. In spite of these differences in compositions in these three compartments, the osmolarity is identical across all three compartments. The body will not tolerate a difference in osmolarity between one compartment and another. If you ever put more particles in one place than the other, water will redistribute so that the osmolarity comes into balance between the compartments. Staying with the definitions, if the barrier we're talking about is the capillary endothelial cell, then we're dealing with oncotic pressure. If the barrier we're talking about is the cell membrane itself, then we're concerned about the tonic pressure. So now let's get into the why do you care about all of this? What is this going to mean to you as clinicians? When you walk into the storeroom in a hospital, you're going to look over on the shelves and you're going to see 15 or so different types of fluids in bags scattered across those shelves. Your job as a clinician is to pick the right bag to fit the needs of the patient. So we're going to talk about what volume, what fluids are appropriate for patients in different conditions. Your choices are, you may want to give the patient blood. You may want to give the patient plasma, which is blood from which the red blood cells have been removed. You may want to give them just the red blood cell component. One series of bags are going to be your salt solutions, the crystalloid solutions. 3 of those crystalloid solutions are going to be 0.9% saline lactated ringers for plasma light. The 0.9% on this is actually a formulary. It's telling you how to mix up the solution. It's 0.9 grams of sodium chloride per 100 mils of water. So the percent means per 100. 50 years ago, you had to make these solutions yourselves. So the simplest way to keep you from having to memorize what the solution was is they just named it based on the formula for mixing up the solutions. It's possible to have some salt solutions that are not isotonic. 0.45% saline is sometimes called half normal saline because you take the same amount of saline into twice the volume of water. You can also mix up a hypertonic saline. It can be anywhere from 5% up to 23%. So like 5 times as concentrated as your isotonic solution, up to 25 times as concentrated. One of the other options is going to be glucose, which goes by the abbreviation D5W, because a former name for glucose was dextrose, and the D5W is a 5 grams of dextrose, 5 grams of glucose per 100 mils. So it's a 5% glucose solution. Lastly, you may choose to give the patient some colloids. These will sometimes be termed plasma volume expanders. They're large molecular weight compounds, which because the compound stays within the vascular space, it pulls the fluid from the interstitial space toward it. So this slide from the New England Journal of Medicine about 8 years ago looks at the concentrations of the different compounds. Plasma is what we've got circulating around within us. These are 3 different salt solutions that you have the opportunity to give your patient. So take a look at this and say, which solution do you think you would want to use if a patient needed volume for their plasma space? Yes.
I think we want to give the patient a normal saline, Professor, because it stays in the vascular volume.
Okay. So normal saline stays within the extracellular space. It doesn't stay within only the vascular space. When we'll talk about that in detail. Now you've got to remember, I'm a physiologist. The physiologist in me wants to put in something that looks most similar to plasma. In spite of that, the most commonly used solution in clinical setting is the isotonic saline, the normal saline. That's because of cost. 1 liter of this costs about $1 US. 1 liter of this costs about $13 US. I tell my students that if I ever end up in front of them and they have a choice of solutions, that I'll give them the extra $10. I want them to use the plasma light because that's the one that matches most closely what the plasma concentration is. In spite of the fact that this is the more ideal solution, by far the most commonly used solution is going to be the isotonic saline. So let's talk about giving isotonic saline. I've got a clinical case where a guy lost blood volume, about 1.5 liters of volume. How much isotonic saline should be given intravenously in order to restore the circulating volume?
I think you can chat also, send a chat for the answer to Professor Rob. So Professor Rob can directly see your answer A, B, C, or D. Everyone, I think. Okay, Prof?
Okay, where would I be able to see that?
Okay, in the chat.
In the chat?
Yes, so you can send to the Professor Rob. So on the chat directly, so to please send to everyone. So A, B, C, or D. So Professor Rob can directly see. Like Derek see the answer.
For some reason, when I'm in the presentation mode, the chat box does not show up.
Oh, sorry,
Oh,
sorry.
okay.
Okay.
So,
Okay, please answer the question, bro, from Professor. Any one
Yes.
of you, please.
so when you look at if the person lost 1.5 liters, most of our students end up selecting C. The reality, okay, there we go, chat. Now I can find the chat. The reality is that you want to give back 4.5 liters. So the reason for posing this question is to alert you that this is going to be something counterintuitive. It's something that you don't expect to see. And you need to understand why you would give back such a large volume when the patient only lost 1.5 liters. So I've got the same type of diagram. I've got my cell water in one space. I've got my interstitial water in a second space and the plasma in yet a third space. The barrier between the plasma and the interstitial space is the endothelium. The barrier between the extracellular fluid and the cell water is the cell membrane. This graph is a little unique in that it's got 0 in the middle of the graph. So going from 0 to 28 liters shows the volume of cell water. Going from 0 to 14 liters shows the volume of the extracellular water. So if I would give an infusion of normal saline, isotonic saline, all of that volume expansion would be on the extracellular space. And that volume would be split evenly between the plasma and the interstitial space. So the patient lost 1.5 liters from this space. The fluid that you put back into him distributes through both the plasma and the interstitial space. So our clinical guidelines say you have to give 3 times as much isotonic saline as you estimate the volume that is lost. That is because the volume does not all stay within the plasma space. The volume distributes throughout both the plasma and the interstitial space. If instead of isotonic saline, I would infuse water, then what's going to happen is that the osmolarity of my body is going to drop below the normal 300 milliosmoles to somewhat less. It is going to get dilute. As soon as you have a drop in your osmolarity, then that is going to cause fluid to move from the extracellular space into the cell. So if I would give 3 liters of water, then that 3 liter, only 1 liter would stay in the extracellular space. 2 liters would actually go into the cell. So by picking a different bag of solution off of the storage shelf, you get a very different effect. In the previous slide, where you give isotonic saline, there was no change in the cell water. All of the volume stayed extracellularly. In contrast, if you would give water, then the volume would distribute equally based on the proportions. 1/3 would stay in the extracellular space, 2/3 would go into the cell, reflecting the regular distribution of volume in the body. So now I'd like to test the concept. So glucose and urea are osmotic particles, but they are not tonic particles. The glucose and urea will transit the cell membrane and will enter the cell. Because of that, they will not exert a long-term effect on the volume distribution in the cell. So I've got time on the x-axis on this graph, I've got cell volume on the y-axis with 0 in the middle of the y-axis. Anything going up is going to be an increase in cell volume. Anything going down is going to reflect a decrease in my cell volume. I've got a couple different behaviors. I've got one line where there's no change in the cell volume. I've got one line where there is an immediate increase in the cell volume. I've got another line where there is a delayed increase in the cell volume. Then I have one line where there's a drop in my cell volume that is maintained, and one line where there's a drop in my cell volume that is transient. So what I would like you to do is to figure out which one of these solutions is isotonic, which one is hyperosmotic, and then match the lines to the infusion choices below. We've got blood, a 3%, 0.9%, and 0.45% sodium chloride, the D5W, or else I've got some lactated ringers to which I've added some additional urea. So does everybody have a sense of what the challenge is in front of them? You're going to have about 5 minutes to work through this problem. And if you have a way to communicate with each other, I encourage you to communicate with each other in order to puzzle your way through this problem. So we'll take about 5 minutes in order to do that. And while you are busy working, I'm going to enjoy some krupek udang and some pempek. So get to work.
Please answer the question. Okay. Which one is it?
And I now can see the chat box. So if you have questions about things, you may type them into the chat box. I'll try and help out.
Okay. Any one of you?
Well, it should take them about 5 minutes to solve this problem. This is a
Yeah.
very complex problem.
Okay. Don't worry to give the wrong answer.
Oh, the goal is to make the mistakes now.
Yeah.
So please, the goal is to work through things.
Yeah.
Excuse me, sir. May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Do we answer on one chat, or do we just privately give you the answer?
The chat would probably be the most useful because we're going to go through it as a group later. So if you're comfortable putting your guess in chat, in addition just to what the letter choice is, indicate why you think that. What led you to that conclusion?
Oh, so we have our answer and the reason as well.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, you got about 1 minute left in order to figure out what's going on. Okay, the answers seem to be lining up better now. So let's go through the logic behind this. I've got a graph which shows over time what happens to the cell volume. 0 is up here. Anything going up above 0 is an increase in cell volume. Anything going down is a decrease in cell volume. So pick on the first one. If I've got a cell and I put it into a solution and the cell volume increases, what is that going to, or start with the simplest one is this line. If there's no change in the cell volume, then that's going to be a reflection of the fluid or the solution was isotonic. So you've got a couple different isotonic fluids up there. Blood will definitely be one of them. 0.9% saline is isotonic. Lactated ringers, if it did not have the urea, would also be isotonic. A second behavior is when I put the cell into the solution, the cell volume goes up. That's going to be the behavior of something that is dilute or hypotonic. And of your solutions up here, the only one that is hypotonic to start with is 0.45%. The third option, line B, initially starts off as an isotonic solution, but then over time becomes hypotonic. This is the behavior of the D5W, the 5% glucose. You mix it up to be 300 milliosmoles, but as the glucose gets taken up into the cell, then what's left behind is water, and gradually it becomes a hypotonic solution. If you would infuse just water into a patient, it's going to lyse or rupture all of the red blood cells. So you don't want to do that. The D5W lets you effectively give water to a patient, but without rupturing all of the red blood cells. If this line's represented the dilute solutions, then the decrease in volume would come when you put the red blood cell into a concentrated solution. So E is going to be the 3% saline. So this is the answer key for the problem. The isotonic fluids are the 0.9% sodium chloride, lactated ringers, or plasma, or blood. The half normal saline would be a dilute solution. The D5W would also be a dilute solution. Because it's a dilute solution, the cells are going to swell when they're exposed to that. When you put in the cell with the 5% saline, the hypertonic saline, that's actually going to pull water out of the cells. So you would use this in order to shrink the cells. This additional urea in lactated ringers is not something that's medically useful, but I put it up there just to make the point that the initial changes that happen are based on the total number of particles. The long-term changes are based on the tonicity of the different solutions. So let's talk about why you would want to use different solutions at different times. If you have a sustained change in your cell volume, the cells are capable of regulating the number of particles that they have within them. So that's termed a regulatory volume increase. So if I have a chronic, as in multiple hours or a couple of days, osmotic imbalance, that causes the solutes to redistribute. If you get increased activity of the sodium potassium ATPase if the extracellular fluid is very dilute. You get a decreased activity of the sodium potassium ATPase if the patient's extracellular fluid is concentrated, and the brain in particular has the ability to generate particles if there's ever prolonged changes in the extracellular fluid osmolarity. Big take-home message. Be careful in correcting chronic osmolar imbalances. And this is where physiology deviates from clinical medicine. My colleague in the Office of Medical Education is an emergency medicine physician. So when we were setting up our curriculum and we were going through this case, I said, if a patient shows up and their plasma osmolarity is high, what solution would you want to give them? And I expected the answer of you would give them a dilute solution because you want to bring the osmolarity back down. And she looked at me and said, no, never. We always give them isotonic saline because we don't know if there's been any regulatory volume increase. We don't know if they've already altered the number of particles in their cell. So in the emergency department, the goal is to keep the patient alive long enough that then you can use nutrition, ingestion, other approaches in order to try and fix the osmotic imbalance. The reason for that is when you look at a generic skeletal muscle cell, and on the cell membrane, I've got the sodium potassium ATPase, the number of particles each time this pump cycles differs. It brings in 2 potassiums and it kicks out 3 sodiums. So if you would ever do anything to increase the activity of this pump, that then means that you will pull out 3 particles. And things that will increase the activity of that pump include giving insulin, beta adrenergics, or if the cell swells, that's going to be a signal to increase this pump activity. If the cell volume is too high, the cell starts dumping particles so the volume can come back down. So the consequence of an increased activity would be to drop your cell osmolarity. It would also lead to hypokalemia and hyperpolarization. In contrast, if you would decrease the activity of this pump using cardiac glycosides like digoxin digitalis, or ATP depletion, or if the cell volume is too small, then that will slow down this pump. That means you will start retaining particles within the cell. That means that there's going to be an increase in the cell osmolarity, as well as the plasma, you'll get a hyperkalemia and a depolarization. So for chronic imbalances, the non-isotonic fluid effects are magnified because the cells may have altered how many particles they have. You want to stay with isotonic saline for the initial correction of chronic imbalances. And that's because the cell volume regulation may have already made adjustments. You can't track in the patient what that is because you don't have access to cell volume composition. Consequently, the initial effect or the initial intervention in this is always to give a hypertonic, an isotonic saline. So same principle. I've got the cell water here, cell membrane separating it, the plasma, and the rest of the extracellular fluid over here. You need to think of this in terms of the diet and the metabolic production of water. First goes into the plasma space. The urine that the body loses is going to come out predominantly from the plasma space. For the other extracellular fluid, you can lose 100 mils per day in the feces. You lose almost a liter per day through insensible water loss. This is water loss as you exhale humidified air. It's also water loss coming across the skin, not through sweating, but just through transpiration. The skin is not a perfect barrier keeping water inside of the body. So generally, the body has to end up in fluid balance. If an individual takes in about 2.3 liters a day, the individual has to lose about 2.3 liters per day through the variety of mechanisms. The parts that are regulated is thirst, regulates how much volume comes in through drinking. The urinary loss is highly regulated by the hormone antidiuretic hormone. So as we examine the fluids that are lost from the body, the vast majority of them are isotonic. Most forms of diarrhea that will impact an adult produce an isotonic fluid. Blood loss from a hemorrhage is an isotonic fluid. And strangely enough, if you would take vomitus and analyze it, it is also an isotonic fluid. There are a limited number of instances where the body can put out a hypotonic or dilute solution. Sweat is a hypotonic or dilute solution. Saliva is a dilute solution, and the form of diarrhea that often impacts infants leads to the loss of a dilute solution. So, does this make sense to you? Our students generally don't like the idea of sweat as being a dilute solution. Is sweat a concentrated solution or a dilute solution?
The sweat salty, so probably a little bit salt in there.
Yeah. And when you think about your sweat, you think about it as being very salty. You think it's a very concentrated solution. The reality is what happens when the body produces sweat, its osmolarity is down about 200, significantly less than the 300 milliosmoles that plasma is. Once that water gets on the surface of your skin, the water evaporates. As the water evaporates, what's left behind is a sodium chloride. So your perception of sweat is that it is a very salty, a very concentrated solution. But in reality, the salt is a very dilute solution when it is produced. It's just after the water evaporates, then you perceive it as being as a much higher concentration. That means patients who are in a hot, arid environment where they lose a lot of sweat are actually losing a dilute solution. Their plasma osmolarity is going to increase. So in terms of the GI fluid, I've got the body weight of an infant at about 3 kilos and an adult at about 70 kilos. An adult's about 60% water, an infant is almost 80% water. So newborns, infants are very much just a bag of salt water. When you look at the volume they turn over per day, For infants, they turn over 16% of their body water each day. That's 1/6 of the total body water. If you look at adults, they turn over about 6%, about 1/16 of their total body water. The take-home point from this is that if you have an adult with diarrhea, it's try and stay hydrated, drink some fluids, wait it out. This isn't going to be a real life-threatening event. You've got time to let your body take care of itself. In contrast, if there's an infant with diarrhea, this gets to be a life-threatening event very quickly. Diarrhea in children turns into a critical problem very quickly, and you have to be ready to intervene very quickly. So I've got a series of figures here where I talk about the extracellular fluid osmolarity and the body volume. I can either have a decreased normal or increased extracellular fluid volume and an increased normal or decreased body volume. What I want to do is to go through the next series of slides and talk about how to interpret information from clinical presentations. So I've got 6 different cases here. In one case, the patient shows up with a loss of volume, and when you pull a sample of blood, the patient's blood is isotonic. Another case where the patient has lost volume, but now when you pull a sample of blood, the patient is hypertonic. And then third, I've got a patient who has lost volume, and when you pull a sample, their plasma is dilute, it is hypotonic. On the bottom 3, I've got the same isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic, but in this case, I'm dealing with a volume expansion in all 3 cases. So what I'd like to do is spend some time working through these figures in order to make sure that you're comfortable interpreting this type of a presentation. So beginning with A, I've got a patient who's lost volume from their body, and when you look at their plasma sample, they're isotonic. How did that occur, and what do you think you should do about it? How are you going to try and help this individual? And for this one, typing into the chat box will be useful. Begin with how did they get that way? Okay, so the solution would be to add water just like the volume that is lost. Drink the same water. So if the volume lost was isotonic, going back to the fluids that are lost, the way this individual could have gotten here is perhaps they had diarrhea, perhaps they had a hemorrhage, or they may have prolonged vomiting. All 3 of those cases will lead to the result of a loss of fluid, but not a change in osmolarity. And what do you want to do to try and help this guy? What are the solutions? So drink the same water volume. If you would ingest just water, would that all stay within the extracellular space? infuse the isotonic saline, and that would be the right choice. So giving the isotonic saline or giving the lactated ringers, or when in the United States, there's a solution called Pedialyte. It's essentially got the same salt solution as Gatorade or sports drinks. And so for adults who have diarrhea, they're recommended just to go get some sports drink, something with both salt and water. If you give water, it won't all stay extracellular. All of the volume loss came from the extracellular fluid space. So you want to put back in a volume, which is going to remain only in the extracellular space. So pick on a completely different case. This time when the patient shows up in front of you, he's lost volume, but when you pull a blood sample, this patient's volume or the patient's plasma is hypertonic. They've got an increase in their osmolarity. How did the individual get this way? Dehydration? And the dehydration, losing a lot of sweat, being water restricted, all of those would result in this case, in this type of a presentation. So what do you want to do to fix this guy? And the answer is give the isotonic saline clinically. As a physiologist, what would I want to do to try and fix the guy? I'm not allowed to do it clinically, but for me, if the defect was caused by losing more water than salt, I would want to give him back more water than salt. So I would look at the half normal saline, the D5W, something that would expand both the cell water space as well as the extracellular fluid space. In the third instance, the patient lost volume, but when you pull a blood sample from him, they're hypotonic. So how did they get this way? What would cause this type of a patient presentation? Sweating would actually be more toward this because sweat is a dilute solution. Sweat would end up with a patient looking more like B. And when you go back to case C, the diagram before this, somehow you got to lose more sodium and chloride than water. So this would be someone who's on a diuretic, so a salt wasting diuretic. That is the only way I can think of so that the individual would lose more sodium than water. So if the patient is in this state, they've lost volume and their osmolarity is low, what do you think, what steps could you take to try and help out this guy? Isotonic saline is what the clinicians will do every time. Where I tend to like the give more salt approach. The patient has lost volume, and because he's lost salt, not only has the volume come out of the extracellular fluid, but additional volume has been pushed into the cells. So pick on the volume expansion situations. So we've got an individual who shows up as volume expanded, and the patient is isotonic. So how could you get an isotonic volume expansion? When you look at the choices for getting there, if the osmolarity doesn't change, one of the ways that you could get there is if you would just have infused an excessive amount of isotonic saline. When you give isotonic saline, it only expands the extracellular space. It does not alter the cell volume. In contrast, if the patient is hypertonic, where you've got volume expansion, but when you pull a blood sample, the osmolarity is high. How could an individual end up in that state? Infusion of hypertonic saline is one way to do it. So somehow you've gotten more salt than water proportionately into this individual, too much salt put into the diet. And then lastly, when you have a patient who is hypotonic, the opposite happens. This individual has lost more salt, or he's got more water on board than salt. So the final use for these figures is, let's talk about how these things actually occur and what you want to do about it. One of the uses for the hypertonic saline is in resuscitation from hemorrhagic shock. So what happens when you give the hypertonic saline is the volume goes into the extracellular fluid, but it pulls even more volume from inside of the cells. So the military was very interested in this solution because you could infuse 1 liter of fluid and get your plasma volume expanded by 4 or 5 liters. The trouble with this, and this actually made it into clinical trials in the United States, where ambulances were carrying around hypertonic fluids. And the trouble with this particular approach is that the patients receiving the hypertonic fluid died at a higher rate than the ones receiving the isotonic saline. The reason for that is that when you have a hemorrhage, the last thing you want to do is to overload the volume in the system and get the pressure too high. Because if it's an uncontrolled hemorrhage, you're just going to start bleeding again from where the site of the injury is. There was one group of patients that showed an improved outcome, that showed an improved survival with the hypertonic fluids, and that was the patients with the head injuries. The trouble with patients with head injuries is that the brain is within the cranial vault, and that's a fixed space. So when there's a brain injury, the cells will swell, and that creates intracranial pressure. A hypertonic fluid pulls the volume out of the cells and helps to relieve the swelling inside of the brain. In terms of the hypotonic solution, one way that you can get this way is through an excessive water ingestion. There's a recreational drug called ecstasy. And one of the characteristics of that drug is the patients get an excessive thirst. So these patients drink massive amounts of water. Because of that, their plasma sodium concentration drops, and you end up with the patients getting seizures from two different reasons. First is because of the electrolyte imbalance from diluting out all of the electrolytes. But the second is because the low osmolarity causes the brain cells to swell. So you get an increase in intracranial pressure occurring at the same time that you're having the drop in the plasma sodium interfering with the action potential. So this covers the key points that I wanted to have. I'd like to use the remainder of the class session just for questions and answers. So at this point, if we were going to look at what it was that we hoped to achieve during the lecture, was given somebody's body weight, estimate how much is their total body water and the volume in the different compartments, identify the normal fluid osmolarity and the concentration of electrolytes, be able to use indicator dilution to measure volumes, identify the major routes and ranges for water intake and loss, and then lastly, to predict the changes in extracellular volume and osmolarity caused by infusing these different solutions. What questions do you have? I'm sure this came at you pretty quickly. Please type questions into the chat box. Okay. So the question about reverse osmosis. The reverse osmosis, when you look at what is going to cause water to move in and out of across a barrier, there is both a pressure and an osmotic pressure to be dealt with. By having the very high pressures, you can overcome the osmotic movement from just the solute concentration. So the reverse osmosis works, and that's used to, it's often used to purify water in order to obtain drinking water from ocean water. Is it safe to drink the water? Yes, it is. Will it affect the fluid in the body because it doesn't contain enough minerals? No, you can even drink distilled water. You can drink the deionized water. The body's going to treat that just as water. So there's no additional harm or downside to it. If you would only ever be exposed to deionized water and never have a chance to get salt either through food ingestion or any other routes, it's theoretically possible that you could deplete the body of needed electrolytes, but you'd have to be doing that a long time. And as soon as you ate any food, you then would be getting the electrolytes that you would need to offset the fact that there are no electrolytes in the water. Very good question. Other questions?
From the chat, you can see, Rob, from the chat.
Yes. Yeah, we talked about the reverse osmosis.
Yes.
Okay.
Is there any question? Everybody, please. So, Prof, that some clinician have the question that for emergency case of the patient with loss of blood due to trauma. So some books recommended to give the linger lactate for isotonic one, but the others said that it's better to give natrium or sodium 0.09%. So which one is better for the first one in emergency case? Yes.
Sure. And when the students get onto their clinical clerkships, at least in our institution, when you're on the surgery rotation, the surgeons like lactated ringers. The emergency medicine department and the medicine department like isotonic saline. So they both function the same. They're both isotonic fluids. And when you look at the outcomes from each, there's no difference in clinical outcomes based on which one you choose. The advantage of the lactated ringers is it includes lactate as an energy source. So if you're dealing with someone who's not able to eat, someone who's not able to get nutrient on board, the lactated ringers does provide some additional nutrient for the patient. And that's probably why the surgeons tend to prefer that. But in terms of clinical outcome, there's no difference in clinical outcomes between the lactated ringers, the isotonic saline, or the plasma light.
Thank you. Does anybody have another question, please? Dr. Harry, maybe you have one question for Professor Rob? Maybe I have one another question. That when I, like you said that when I was in the clerkship 20 years ago, that we have to make our own solution for the baby who got diarrhea. Yes. So it's a kalium composite, and we have to add sodium and others. So for now on, because I'm not a clinician, is there any solution that already packaging for this kind of solution for diarrhea, Dr. Rob?
Not intravenously, but there's a solution in the United States called Pedialyte, which is a pediatric
Pedialyte, yeah.
solution.
Okay.
And so that is designed more for the types of diarrhea that will impact infants. So it is a dilute solution. It's not as concentrated as isotonic saline, and that's better balanced to try and fix the water and salt imbalance that happens when infants get diarrhea.
Thank you. So from the faculty member, do you have any question besides the student? Everyone?
Excuse me, Dr.
I
Ivan.
have a question for you, Professor Carroll.
Okay, the first one, Dr. Swani and then Hadisa. Okay, please, Dr. Swani.
Okay, in Indonesia, we have a lot of problem of a case of dengue hemorrhagic fever. And usually, what is the best solution for the patient of that? Usually the colloid started with the colloid solution, or we start with the lactate ringer? There is a
Right.
much debate about that.
So when you look at the different solutions that you have available to you, let me go back to, when you look at the different solutions, if the problem with the dengue fever is a cardiovascular collapse, if they're not able to keep their blood pressure sufficiently high, then the plasma volume expanders, the albumin, the hydroxyethyl starch, would be a way to get volume that will remain within the vascular space and won't cause an expansion of volume elsewhere. I don't know the etiology of the disease enough to know whether the individuals get dehydrated in the later stages of the dengue. But if they would get dehydrated, then that's when looking at the saline solutions, the isotonic saline, lactated ringers, would be more useful to take care of, to try and fix the dehydration. So the colloids, the plasma volume expanders, only help the cardiovascular system. They don't fix a fluid imbalance elsewhere. And in fact, they may make the fluid imbalance worse because they'll pull volume from the interstitial space and put it into the cardiovascular space.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Thank you. Okay, okay. May I have another question?
Please.
Yeah, you mentioned about the chronic. You give infusion. You have to be careful of the chronic change in osmolarity of the patient. So
Yes.
what the parameter that should be the clinician aware of that, the danger of the chronic change in osmolarity in the blood, because in the body, because usually when we first patient gave the infusion, and then for example gave the isotonic crystalloid, and then it maintained. And after that, we are not aware of that, and then just take for granted everything goes well. But after that, you change. Maybe you give us some tips for that. Thank you for.
Certainly. I think you would be good friends with my emergency medicine colleague. The clinical goal is not necessarily to fix the underlying problem. The clinical goal is to keep the patient alive. Because of that, when there's a fluid balance, a defect, the isotonic solution is always their starting event. It may not fix the underlying deficit, but it will support the cardiovascular system. It will support the rest of the systems. And then you can try and fix either the too much salt or not enough salt through diet, through other approaches. So the clinical emphasis is to, at least particularly in emergency medicine, is to keep the patient alive. And if you would try and fix the problem right away, you actually run the risk of overshooting and creating the mirror image problem in the patient. So that's why the infusion solutions, isotonic saline is always the right answer in the emergency department for if you're going to give a solution, unless you're dealing specifically with head injury or you're dealing with a volume expansion from too much water ingestion.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Not overshooting. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Prof. That's enough. Terima kasih, Dr. Irfan.
Sama-sama, Dok. Halisa, you want to give the question, please?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Irfan and Professor Robert. Maybe my questions is not really relatable with the lecture, but I want to ask about the plasma transfusion for the COVID patients. And I want to ask why it must be the plasma that could be transferred, and how it will give some impact for the donor and the donee. Thank you, Professor.
Certainly. So when you consider what's in the plasma, the component of the plasma that's most valuable for treating the COVID patients is the antibodies. The antibodies are large proteins, and by giving whole plasma from people who've survived and developed antibodies against the virus, those antibodies will then attack the virus as they're transfused into a new patient. The challenge with doing that is that it does not, if you do not completely get rid of the virus, then the patient's body is not producing antibodies. You just gave it to them like a drug. And as soon as the drug is gone, then the virus has a chance to reassert itself. So in the United States, the plasma treatments are usually reserved for patients who are in very, very bad shape and used almost as a mechanism of last resort. And it's because the plasma protein component within the plasma is the valuable aspect.
So, Professor, is that give some impact for the blood osmolality, either for the donor and the donee?
Right. And you can take, like, for example, when you donate blood, you don't change your plasma osmolarity. The mental image for this is, think about a kettle of soup, and you go in with a ladle and you scoop out some soup and you put it into a bowl. You haven't changed the concentration in either side. All you've done is taken the same amount of particle, if you stirred up the soup, the same amount of particle and volume out. So as long as what's lost is proportional, you don't end up changing the volume. Similarly, when there's a hemorrhage, you lose volume from the body, but because you lose proportionally as much salt as water, that does not create an osmotic imbalance. So giving a plasma hemorrhage, as long as the fluid exchanges are proportionately as much salt as water, then that's not going to alter the osmotic state of the body.
Okay, thank you so much for the answer, Professor.
So, does anyone have another questions? Please. So, if you have no other questions, so I think our session will be ended soon. So, Professor Rob, maybe you can give some summarize or final message or take-home message for our audience here. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with your students. Teaching students is one of the great pleasures of our profession. For the students, as you're learning material, make sure you challenge yourself. So this lecture had things relatively superficial about what is normal plasma concentrations, but recognize when you get into the clinical settings, they're going to put you into a room and say, go get some fluids for this patient. So you're going to have to look at the characteristics of everything you do and understand why you're selecting the different components as you're making decisions about how you're going to take care of the patients. So the fluid infusion solutions and which ones to choose is something that even at this stage of your training, you should be able to project all the way through why I would want to choose that one, why I would want to choose something else. And I just encourage you to mechanistically understand what it is that you are going after. So,
okay.
Thank you for the time and the opportunity to meet with you today.
Okay, thank you, Professor Rob. So I think everybody, so that's all for our session today. And it's I think it's very interesting and it is very useful for us, especially for you, because after this module, you will be learned about clinical case model, system-based clinical model. So I hope that this lecture, you have to keep it, and don't worry that Professor Rob already give us the lecture slide, so we will share it to you. It is okay, Professor Rob? We can
Sure.
share to our student, okay?
Yes,
So
please.
we will share to you after this. So no worry that you can learn more, and also that Professor Rob also had a book, Integrated Physiology. So as you may know that our university already members of Clinical K Elsevier. So you can contact to our library to get the Professor of books about integrated physiology. It's free for you if you ask via our library. Yeah, you can learn this. Also another books, so many books. So I think that's all, Professor Rob. Thank you very much for your nice lecture, for your time, for your sharing, for your knowledge for us, especially for our student. And I believe that this lecture is very useful for us as a base of our student to learn more about the clinical case, especially to cure the water problem or the fluid problem in patient's bodies. Thank you, Professor Rob. Ayo adik-adik beri applause. Please give your applause for Professor Rob and say thank you for him. Okay. Bye-bye. Selamat ya. Kasih tepuk tangan. Ucapkan salam ya. Terima kasih. Ayo.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you so much,
much,
Prof.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Bye.
Okay. Oh, ya. So